Because what are you going to say for a plot overview? It's a fucking nightmare of a book in terms of plot. Hello and welcome to On the Same Page, a podcast in which two mates separated by oceans and hemispheres talk about books and catch each other up on life between the lines. Unfortunately, we can't get together in person, but through this podcast, we hope to get on the same page. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of On the Same Page. I am Seamus, and with me, as always, is Blake. Blake, how are you? How was your week?
Oh, not too shabby, thanks, Shame. Pretty decent week. Getting excited about my prodigal return to Australia for a little jaunt in the sunshine.
2
and
weeks
the gum
away.
trees. Something like that. Let's keep it under wraps. We don't want the airport to get surged with the fans and whatnot.
Yeah,
it'll be the Beatles in 1964 all over again.
Luckily, these podcasts are delayed, so this probably won't come out till after you're back.
It's a very good point. That is the...
You're too late, fans. He's already here.
Sorry, guys. It would have been a COVID risk. We just couldn't take it this time. Just couldn't take those kind of crowds.
Yeah.
It's just not a good idea. It would be an absolute super spreader event like the world has never seen.
Yep.
For the two people in Australia who still remember me.
Me and your mother.
That's about it. And even my mother's a bit foggy.
Oh, you can pick him up? Sweet, that's me off the
hook. Yeah. Pretty much. That's the dealio. I think I'll get back with the old hitchhike and try and get the ferry.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I gotta get across the harbour.
Yeah.
Well, not too shabby at all. How about you? How was your week?
Yeah, pretty quiet week. First week back to work, which is never fun, but I got through it.
It's a tough life.
It is a tough life.
You're a trooper.
I know. I do it for the people. I do it for the podcast. Got to make the money. So did you?
Yeah, it's just nice of you to, just to put in your, your daily effort, get your salary. Obviously, you don't need it because the podcast is so lucrative, but
correct.
You're still doing your bit.
Charity, really. Yeah, my job is my charity, and this is the moneymaker. This podcast.
Mm-hmm. Really.
Yeah. I'm just not giving you any of the funds.
Oh, really? I was wondering where that was all going.
Expenses.
Well.
Yeah. So did you have any inner shelf moments this week?
I was just thinking that today. I went for a long walk.
Lovely.
Very cruisy. It was a nice, I wouldn't call it a blue sky day, but there was slashes of blue. There was evidence of sky. So I, put on my best dress and ran out into the world. And I listened to an episode of Conversations, the ABC program Conversations. And it was about, the title was The Countess of Kirribilli. Do you know what I'm talking about?
As in the podcast or the specific episode?
The specific episode.
No.
With a biographer of Elizabeth von Arman, who was a great writer, and I had never really heard of her. I might have heard of her in a peripheral way because she was kind of very involved in a lot of different, people's lives. But I don't know. I was captivated by the story because I can't believe I'd never really come across it before. She was born in Kirribilli, on Kirribilli Point. Her uncle lived in the Governor General's house there, or the Admiralty house there.
Must be nice.
But it must be very nice. I think her father was a kind of pretty well-off merchant, and her mother was came from a pretty poor farmstead in Tassie. And but they left when she was 5 and she never came back. But she lived this extraordinary life, moved to the UK and then to Switzerland. And then when she was like 16 or a bit older, she married this old fat German count, and they moved to Berlin and she hated it. And then they ended up buying like a schloss, like a kind of manor house, a castle somewhere in the Baltic Sea. And then she lived there and she had this garden, and she had a bunch of girls. I think she had 4 girls and a son off this count. And when she was there, she wrote a book called Elizabeth and Her German Garden, which was like a literary sensation all over the English-speaking world. Sounds hilarious. I was trying to find a copy online and I couldn't find one, but she's apparently she went out of print for like 40 years, and she came back in the 80s. And then she's kind of gone quiet again, and no one, like, I've never heard of her. And apparently she's had another resurgence in COVID, which is interesting. Some of her her novels, which had this amazing life. And then she long story short, that count died. She had a 3-year affair with H.G. Wells, who obviously absolute cad. I think we talked to him in a recent episode about Rebecca West having a child from H.G. Wells. That man got around.
Yeah.
And apparently in his diaries, he said that they broke every bed frame in Europe. Oh, goodness. Apparently. Jeez. So red hot.
My goodness.
And then that ended, a tumultuous affair ended. She ended up marrying the older brother of Bertrand Russell, James Russell, who was an earl. And he was apparently a nutcase or like a weirdo. And like he was a peer in the House of Lords, even ended up getting trialed in the House of Lords for bigamy. And then he turned into a real kind of psychological, nightmare, and controlling her and all these kind of things. All the while she's writing these international best-selling books, amazing writer, apparently a satirist, really funny. And then, gets through the World War One and ends up dying in the 1940s. But just a crazy life to come from like 1860s Kirribilli to this extraordinary European heights of literature and culture. And she had houses in Switzerland and London, and she was a real literary light at the time, this kind of elder statesman who knew everyone, was in she was a cousin of Catherine Mansfield. Anyway, so I was just enraptured by this whole story I was listening to walking around today. And that's Elizabeth von Arman. So I'm pretty excited to maybe get in and try and read some of her stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not from Germany and I don't know, and I don't live there, but I feel like anyone with a last name with von in it is just oozing wealth.
Must be nice to have a Von in your name.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the Von Trapp family from, what is that, Sound of Music. Yeah.
Yeah. That didn't end well, though. So maybe not the Von Trapps.
Did they? No, they didn't die. They escaped.
Did they?
Yeah. They flee to Austria over the mountains.
Right. I thought they got trapped in the end. I can't remember.
They're trapped like right at the very end, and then the nuns help them by taking apart the Nazis' engines.
Right.
And they managed to just escape over the mountains. I don't know how true the film is, but I assume it. Maybe they just
is it based off a real story? I don't even know.
I thought it was.
Is it?
Maybe it's not. Oh, don't listen to us, people. But keep listening.
You don't need to know that. All you need to know is Julie Andrews is killing it. That's about it.
Still killing
She's dancing around, having the time of her life on those hills. And I like it. A lot of people don't know about it, but I think it's it's a bit faded with time, that one. It hasn't. I think it used to be a must watch for everyone.
Yeah, I've seen it many times. It was one of those films we just watched growing up.
Did you grow up in the 1940s?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm 70 right now.
Well, must be very nice.
My skincare routine is flawless.
Yeah, you're doing very well. Is that Maybelline?
Yeah.
Must be. What about your inner shelf this week?
This week, my inner shelf is Amazon released their first little teaser trailer of the upcoming Lord of the Rings series. And
is that what I sent you? I don't even know what it was that I sent you. I thought you'd be interested.
Yeah, I'd already seen it when you sent it to me, and my brother also sent it to me. And it was just their upcoming little teaser trailer. So you didn't even watch it.
I watched it was some smelting of metal and some pouring of that into a cast that said Lord of the Rings or something, or no, whatever's the title, Rings of Power, which I don't know, sounds like a kind of like a, I don't know, a brothel that specializes in rim jobs or something. But yeah, Rings of Power. They could have done something better with that. Or is that a Tolkien title?
Well, I think they're talking about the Rings of Power, which are the 3 for the elves, 5 for the dwarf, 7 for the dwarves, and 9 for the men.
You don't need to tell me, mate. I know who the fucking Rings of Power and shit are.
I think it's about that. So
I'm all
I don't
over
know
the
if they've
Rings of Power.
released too much. I think they've got rights to 5 seasons, and each season's going to be standalone in itself. It's not going to be a continuous story.
Is PJ doing it? Oh, Peter Jackson?
No.
Oh wow! So this is a whole new
thing,
vision.
Yeah.
Tolkien. Right.
So I'm quite nervous. I think most people are a bit nervous about it because I hope they do it justice. I don't know. I saw the trailer and was very, very nervous about it because it looks fake. And then they released a video of making the trailer and it's all real. That's all. There's no special effects used at all, even though it looks quite fake. They've obviously just shot it in like 10K or something, but it's completely all real. So that sort of gives me a little bit of hope that they understand the assignment, that no one wants to see a heavily CGI'd TV show. They prefer the realistic stuff because that's what everyone hated about The Hobbit, was it was just saturated in CGI. So that's my inner shelf moment. Bit nervous, bit wary, but still going to watch it, of course.
Well, they've got you. Absolutely got you. There's no
by the balls. By the balls.
By them big, loose, juicy balls.
Yeah, these 70-year-old nuts.
So I've been told. Yeah, exactly. Well, let's crack on because we have a cracker of a novel to discuss today. We are going deep dive into Sula by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison's second novel. I can't remember when it was published, early 70s, mid 70s, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
And it's I think, definitely one of her. I haven't read all of Toni Morrison. Have you? Well, I mean, let me ask you, how have you come to Sula and Toni Morrison? Where are you at with Morrison?
This is my first Toni Morrison.
Nice.
Actually, that's interesting. We spoke for ages about reading a book together, which was something we always wanted to do, like a mini sort of book club so we could discuss it, which I guess was sort of the first inklings of a podcast just between us. And then when I came back to Sydney, I started reading Anna Karenina and you were like, fuck it, let's both read Anna Karenina. We both read that over whatever it was, 2-3 weeks, and then hated it. And then we didn't talk about what book we were reading next, and both by chance picked up Sula.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
It was good. I mean, I think we were let down. And when you're let down, you've got to go to something which isn't going to fail you. And Toni Morrison doesn't fail.
And this was short as well. This is a novella. So after lunging through, it's shortish. Short. Yeah. It's probably on the longer side of a novella. But after Anna Karenina, anything's short.
True that. I mean, after Anna Karenina, life is short.
Yeah.
So much of it has been wasted on that book.
In the fields with Levin. Oh
God, how much fucking chopping down of shit can you do? Like, okay.
Only like 100 pages. Yeah.
Let us not let him waste any more of our time. Because we've got Sula to discuss.
Got a good episode to go. Yeah. So that was our first reading, and then we reread it just the past week.
Yeah, gave it a little reread, which is good because, like you said, it's not that long. And I really enjoyed the reread. I enjoyed it the first time, but I enjoyed it again more so. I first encountered Morrison. I think I knew of Morrison for a long time. I mean, as I've said on this podcast before, I'm kind of like a Baldwin obsessive from a long time back, and Baldwin was a big influence on Toni Morrison. They were close. Morrison did a eulogy for him. And their fiction, I mean, there's critical compilations of their work where academics kind of put each works of theirs together, and talk about them in relationship to each other. And for instance, like Jazz in Another Country. But this is, I first encountered. I first read Beloved. That was my first Toni Morrison in a 20th century American fiction class when I was studying in Montreal. Yes.
Because I just bought that book like 2-3 weeks ago.
I'm interested to reread it actually, because I kind of had been, I don't know, starting out in my real kind of deep dive into literature. So in my early 20s, I've been reading lots of other kind of stuff and the odd novel here and there, but suddenly kind of just gradually slipped and just fell completely in love with novels, particularly. And poetry. And so I was kind of, you're reading different things. You one name leads to another. You're not really sure exactly where you're at, or, and so your growth is quite sporadic and spread out. And, you don't really know what you're going to get each time. Sometimes you're not ready for a book. Sometimes you kind of force your way through something and then you come back years later and you're like, whoa, I don't remember this at all. That was completely different.
Yep.
So I'm interested to go back because I don't know, in this book, in that class, I think I had to read like 20 books in a semester or in a term.
Yeah.
And some of the books really, I had, you're reading like The Great Gatsby, and you're reading, I think we're reading some not Fenimore Cooper, but we're reading some with Sound and the Fury and Beloved and, all sorts of things. So you're kind of just smashing through them. And I don't know, I was quite struck by Morrison, but I don't think I was ready for her. And especially not that book, which is a particularly astounding book. So I'm interested to go back and read that.
If it's anything like my uni, we were doing a book a week in literature. So it was sort of like very stressful. You'd have to read a novel a week. You do 1 or 2 classes on it, and then it was just gone. And there was no room for like deep diving, I guess. It was sort of read it quickly, talk about it in class, and then move along to the next one. So
yeah, I remember it being pretty
so many
quick.
books that I'd like to go back and reread from uni as well, because I don't feel like I got to properly read them.
Yeah, I think it's a bit too quick. I wish they'd give you a bit more time, but I guess you don't have to tune into each of them. You can kind of pick your battles. But I really there was something to it, and I became interested in Morrison and read a lot of her essays, and Mouthful of Blood is an essay collection of essays that I had for a while. And then in my master's, I had to read Playing in the Dark and things like that. And I read jazz when I was doing my my thesis on Baldwin's Another Country. But reading Sula was, I don't know, it was nice to go to early Morrison and to see, I think, a second novel is an interesting time, I guess, for a writer. And I think it's a marvelous work. It's incredible. The concision is amazing. The amount that she's able to get in, the amount that she's able to get across in such a short space is fantastic. And it talks about so much and broaches so many aspects of American life and of just life in general, that you can have this kind of great novel about a friendship, and a quite tragic friendship in many ways, and it's buffeted by a kind of larger theme of PTSD and gentrification of a town, and how a town grows over time, and history, and how it affects different peoples and stuff like that, which is very, very Morrison. So yeah, I mean, I guess we should do a little bit overview of the plot for our listeners who maybe haven't read Sula, and hopefully maybe that listening to us, they get a bit of a taste for it and go back. It's set in a town called Medallion, or rather it's set in a town called Bottom, which is in the hills, ironically, not the bottom, it's in the hills above the town of Medallion, which is in the valley, rich farming land. White people come and kick all, which was a former African-American community. They go, get out. We want all this nice, arable land in the valley. You guys go and hang up in the hills. And so all the African-Americans get pushed up into the hills in this place called the Bottom. And they're told it's called the Bottom because it's the bottom of heaven. It's the, the first place that
And the white man wishes he could have that land, but
yeah. And then later on he does, because it's got the nice views, and then the whole thing gets reversed. And they're not farmers anymore, and they're not making money off the land anymore, and they just want to have the nice views and the golf courses and whatever. So yeah, there's that whole story which we can get into. And basically it starts off with a bit of a talk of this town, of the racial delineation and discrimination, people can't get jobs and this sort of thing. And the First World War starts, and you have men coming back with PTSD. There's a guy called Shadrach who comes back, and he is severely shell shook, and he kind of starts this thing called National Suicide Day, where he walks around ringing a bell, and he basically just hangs in this very ordered shack, a very well ordered shack down by the river, and he kind of catches fish and just kind of gets drunk and yells, and everyone just kind of accepts his presence.
Yep.
And he kind of bookends his story, kind of bookends the larger story, which is of two protagonists, Sula, of the eponymous Sula, and Nell, two young girls, friends, kind of polar opposites in terms of there being two kind of people in life. There's the person who takes the safe road, and there's the person who takes the risky road.
Yes.
Sula's the risk taker, Sula's the individualist, Nell's the, just tries to do the right thing. And there's some pretty major shit that happens. I think one of the things which, I don't know how you feel about this, I can continue the plot overview as we go along, but something which Morrison is always surprising to me about Morrison, especially because there's so much, excuse me, there's such a brilliant softness and tenderness of sensibility in a lot of Morrison, that she also has this really gruesome streak. Yes. And I think like one of the first images of Sula is Shadrach in Verdun or somewhere in World War One, and someone next to him's face gets blown off and dribbles down their spine.
Yeah,
something. I don't know if dribbles is the verb, but and then at one point Sula cuts the tip of her own finger off, and there's all sorts of gruesomeness. How do you get by with the gruesomeness?
It was odd. It was like coming to this. I'd never read Toni Morrison, and to be opening with Shadrach, I was confused. I didn't know what was going on. I was like, this isn't Sula. Who's Sula? Where's Sula? We've had an overview of a town. We're now going to World War One with Shadrach. What is going on? But yeah, she is quite visceral in some of her descriptions of like the melting down the spine, cutting her finger off. There's when the baby is constipated and she's got to put her finger up his ass. Like, she's
the lard, the last bit of lard that she uses to lubricate her finger. Yeah.
She's
the pebbles of frozen
pebbles. She's she doesn't shy away from certain things, which I don't know. Is that common through all her books, or is that just a Sula thing? I think
so. No, it's not just a Sula thing. It's really she doesn't shy away, and I think that's what's also most endearing about her. And obviously, motherhood's an interesting theme in this book. Motherhood's often a big theme. It's a massive theme in Beloved, and she raised her kids by herself, Toni Morrison, after divorce. And I think she's not afraid, perhaps like some writers before her, to really talk about these moments which are so human. And a mother kind of loosening the bowels of her child who's constipated, and just to I don't know, finger it with so much drama and to make it so interesting, detail, as Morrison always does. Amazing detail and image creation. And just this, there's so much concision in this book, the way she's able to relate so much, so many years of time of like suffering, or years of a relationship, or long periods of time between characters, or in a certain of one character's dealing with an issue or something like that. The way she is able to do it by painting one clear image of one event, like loosening the bowels of a child, as a way to describe what that child is like. And that's Plum, I think, as a baby, is it? And then
I think it's Plum. Yeah.
And she's, the whole thing about Plum is that, or from Eva, so Sula's grandmother is Eva, and Sula, when she's young, witnesses Eva, Plum goes to World War One as well, also comes back shell shook, and he becomes a heroin addict. And Eva, the mother, the grandmother of Sula, and the mother of Plum, is, I don't know, decides to burn her son alive when he's in a heroin stupor. And Sula kind of witnesses this. It's one of the kind of two real defining events of Sula's childhood. And, it has this whole lead up, where she talks about the loosening of when Plum's a baby and all this kind of stuff. And she's talking about how this baby never even wanted to come out of her. And then the whole time when he was a baby, all he wanted to do was crawl up back in her womb. And then he was doing the same thing now. He was just kind of grown-ass man. And now he was coming back from the war and he was all shell shook and he was just a baby basically again. And she couldn't take it and she burned him alive.
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, that's putting it very tersely, but it's a thing. And then the other major event, which kind of defines Sula and also Nell's upbringing, is the drowning of Chicken Little, who's this kind of just local boy. And Nell and Sula are playing on the riverside, and this kid comes along and they make him climb a tree and they're kind of playing with him. And then they start doing that spinning around thing where you hold someone's arms and spin around, and he slips free and falls in the river and never comes out.
Yeah, dies.
And there's this, she thinks that Shadrach, whose shack is across the river, has seen it and no one else has seen it. And she goes across and she's like, distraught. She's really young at this point.
And she's 11.
And goes into Shadrach's place and Shadrach just says, always.
Always.
That's all he says. And she's like, what? And runs away.
Yeah.
And and you find out, I mean, it's just to kind of finish off the quick plot overview. Then Sula leaves for 10 years or something. She goes to Howard. Yeah. She goes to college. She goes and lives in New York. She lives in Nashville. She lives over the South. She travels. She sees the world. She gets up to things. She has a life outside of this small town. And then she comes back. And she comes back and everyone hates her because, now she's left and she's come back. She thinks she's better than us. She's different. She's not the same as us. And that's kind of where the main part of the story and the main part of Nell and Sula and what happens between them and what happens in the end happens. I don't know. I don't know how much spoilers we should give. Read the book.
Yeah.
Or don't.
I mean, it's a deep dive for us, so I reckon just spoil everything.
Yeah. So
that's an overview. If you don't want to listen to the rest of the episode and read it first, I'd probably stop now and read it and then listen to everything else that happens. But
there we go.
Now on in, spoilers are everywhere.
Yeah, this is only our second deep dive podcast. So just tell us what you think. If you think that we should just treat it as if everyone's read the books, or if you just want to.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Good. That's settled then. Don't worry about the emails,
guys. So you think those two moments are the big two moments in her life that shape her?
I mean, I think so. I mean, that is, I'm drawn to Sula in a kind of, reflection in a shop window kind of way because, she is this exile character and she is this, she's an artist without an art form. That's kind of why she's an outcast. She's an outcast, but
that's that great line. Yeah.
Two different, she's an outcast for reasons of nurture and nature.
And
born an artist, so you're an outcast, but these two catalytic events in her childhood also send her kind of careering away. And of course, as we've discussed in other episodes, once you leave, you grow in different ways, and you're different. You're not the same person when you come back. And but anyway, she was always different. And but that's there's a line in Ulysses somewhere where Joyce says that they for there to be a reconciliation, there has to be a sundering. And that's always, that's the kind of why exile, I think, is so fertile as a literary, point of birth, is just that someone is cut off, they're severed, and then they've got to kind of reimagine that connection or come back and try and make it. And that just, it makes for such a painful beauty all the time. And, I think Sula really is a kind of prodigal character. She's not a prodigal son because she doesn't have any of the privileges of a prodigal son. She's hated. The town doesn't like her. The town treat her like a kind of witch. She's blamed for everything. And of course, she kind of feeds into that. Part of her audacity is that, she's audaciously individual. She's defiant. Fuck everyone. She sleeps with all their husbands. Sleeps with Nell's husband, Jude, which is what happens between the girls. But Nell doesn't even think about it, because sex is something we can talk about in this book, because sex is a very particular, traumatic manifestation for Sula. Yep. But, I think there is this particular kind of self-loathing that Sula has, and she's trying to cover it up in all sorts of ways. But ultimately she's hated because she stands out, because she's different. When we have that, she's marked out from the beginning. She has this birthmark over her eye, and the birthmark changes depending on who's looking at it, which is a lovely device. There's I think to Nell, it's a stemmed rose. To Jude, it's a copperhead snake. To someone else, it's Hannah's ashes. Hannah's is a mother. Who burns alive, another burning alive. Yeah. And
it's
and
interesting that we spoke about abstraction last week, like you were saying, and she gets treated like shit by the town, basically, which then feeds into her actions. I mean, it says in the book that she doesn't take any notice of it, but I think when the whole town's calling you a witch, you hear about it.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of good quotes which kind of set up these two sides of Sula, or these two things which drive the course of her life. The first one is the kind of town's opinions of her, and how those two events shaped her life. And the second one is that that kind of artist without an art form idea. So the first begins with a there, and the there being bottom, the town. Their evidence against Sula was contrived, but their conclusions about her were not. Sula was distinctly different. Ava's arrogance and Hannah's self-indulgence merged in her, and with a twist that was all her own imagination, she lived out her days exploring her own thoughts and emotions, giving them full rein, feeling no obligation to please anybody unless their pleasure pleased her. As willing to feel pain as to give pain, to feel pleasure as to give pleasure. Hers was an experimental life. Ever since her mother's remarks sent her flying up those stairs, ever since her one major feeling of responsibility had been exorcised on the bank of a river with a closed place in the middle. The first experience taught her there was no other that she could count on. The second, that there was no self to count on either. She had no center, no speck around which to grow. And then the second one, so that's kind of her nurture, the effects of her experience and how that's affected her. And then the first one is, in a way, her strangeness, her naivete, her craving for the other half of her equation was the consequence of an idle imagination. Had she paints or clay, or knew the discipline of the dance or strings, had she anything to engage her tremendous curiosity and her gift for metaphor, she might have exchanged the restlessness and preoccupation with whim for an activity that provided her with all she yearned for. And like any artist with no art form, she became dangerous.
Great line. Yeah, going back to that first one, so the first time I read it, that didn't stand out that much. And I sort of took her shaping from the two big moments, like you said, but then reading it the second time, that part really stuck out because just before she goes to the river and accidentally drowns Chicken Little, she goes back inside of her house and she overhears her mum talking, and her mum basically says, I love Sula, but I don't like her. And she's 11 at this stage, 11 or 12. And hearing that as a kid, she's like very confused. And that sort of sends her flying up the stairs, as the quote says. And that to me stood out as like a pretty foundational moment of she's just heard her mother say that her mum doesn't even like her. And that sort of drives her up the stairs, I guess. And that to me stood out as another foundational moment of who she became and why she became the way she did. She realized she had to depend on just herself. If her own mother doesn't like her, who's going to like her? So that was one of the moments that stuck out to me upon the second read. I don't know if that stood out to you at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really has that, she has no one else to rely on but herself. I think she probably should have maybe given Nell a bit more credit, perhaps, but she, I think she really discovers this, because she's born this artist, this individual already. She just survives on that alone and kind of creates this great defiance, which she protects herself with because she's afraid. I mean, when she cuts off the tip of her finger because some Irish boys are bullying them, she, Morrison writes that she mutilated herself to protect herself. That, if she just cut off her finger and did something drastic, they would leave her alone, and that she wouldn't feel pain. She'd feel pain preferable to fear, more or less. I think that's really, demonstrative of kind of how she approaches the rest of her life, why she runs, why she perhaps comes back, and why she really decides, she doesn't have an art form, but she has a very distinct and powerful attachment to her instincts. And she kind of just decides to live on her instincts, or perhaps she has no choice but to live on her instincts, because so she just does, she doesn't really think about it. When she's on her deathbed and her and Nell have been kind of, distanced for a long time because because Sula slept with Nell's husband, Jude. Nell asks her, like, why did you do it? She's like, I don't know why I did it.
Yeah.
And in one way, of course, she does know, like, that's not the whole truth. But in another way, she isn't lying, in the sense that she doesn't know really why she's so cripplingly defiant, why she's behaving, why she's so reliant on her instincts in the way she is. Because it's I think there's, what Morrison calls it in that quote, her preoccupation with whim. And there's another great, aspect of Sula's character, I think, or the driving dichotomy in Sula, I think that Morrison is trying to get to, is between freedom and responsibility. That for Morrison, Morrison believes that freedom is freedom to choose your responsibility, whereas Sula thinks freedom from responsibilities is freedom, and they're very, very different things. And so, Sula is more or less under a delusion, or under an illusion, that if she just has no responsibilities, and of course that ultimately means that she doesn't love, because that's the ultimate commitment, the ultimate responsibility, then, she won't feel any more pain. She won't be in any more trouble than she already is. That's her big defense. She's cut off that tip. So she can't,
Interesting.
She can't do that. And, in fear, she kind of becomes this unshakable figure. And, in fear, she runs to individuality, and she lives by her instincts from there on out. So she doesn't really realize that that's a trap, that it's much more of a trap than the freedom of responsibility of choosing something. You know, I think she has a long affair with Ajax, and then at some point she kind of finds this guy Ajax, and she finds his driver's license and finds out that his name isn't Ajax, it's Albert Jax.
Yeah.
And she's like, wow, you know, I've basically been fuck buddies with this guy for like a decade or however long it's been, and I didn't even know his name. And she does love this guy. I mean, she won't admit it to herself, but she does love this man. And she's like, how can I love this man and how can he love me if I don't even know his name? Because she's so afraid of committing. And so, you know, she acts out of whim, and there's kind of two kinds of whim, and they, you know, create two you know, this great shining figure of Sula, which is Nell's Sula before Sula breaks her heart by fucking her husband. But before that, you know, Nell looks at Sula as this, you know, this constant light, this source of humor, this I think there's a good quote where here's a good quote. You know, Nell says that it was she alone who saw this magic. She knew it was all due to Sula's return to the bottom. It was like getting the use of an eye back, having a cataract removed. Her old friend had come home, Sula, who made her laugh, who made her see old things with new eyes, in whose presence she felt clever, gentle, and a little raunchy. Sula, whose past she had lived through and with whom the present was a constant sharing of perceptions. Talking to Sula had always been a conversation with herself. Was there anyone else before whom she could never be foolish? In whose view inadequacy was mere idiosyncrasy, a character trait rather than a deficiency? Anyone who left behind that aura of fun and complicity? Sula never competed. She simply helped others to define themselves. Other people seemed to turn their volume on and up when Sula was in the room. More than any other thing, humor returned. You know, that's such, it's a kind of, an image of Sula, which, you know, only Nell has, but which is clearly, you know, when you see her, she's this real wit and kind of, you know, firecracker, and, you know, everyone wants to be around her. All the men in town want to be with her because she's just this attractive person. You know, that reminds me, there's a line about Shakespeare writes a line in Henry IV, Part 2, about Falstaff, where he says he was not just a wit, but the cause of wit in other people. And, you know, that's a kind of Oscar Wilde level of, you know, you're not so impressive and amazing that you make people feel small around you, but that you make them feel tall around you.
Yeah.
And that's a real genius for friendship. That's a genius for wit and whim. And so that's the real light side of whim in Morrison's eyes. But then it's got that dark side of you know, this running away from the world. And you know, so there's whim, which is, in one way you can look at it as being, have the courage of your feelings and your intuitions and instincts. I think that Emerson, he used to have whim written in over his door frame, you know, as a kind of reminder to have the confidence of his imagination and things like that. And, you know, whenever anyone asks me why I moved to Germany, I usually say I did it on a whim. Basically, I just, but, you know, kind of like Sula, I did it on a whim because I was avoiding responsibility. And, you know, whim has a dark side. That's what Morrison is writing about, I think, in Sula's way. And, you know, when you're pursuing that kind of whim, where you resort to that kind of whim as a defense against the world, where you either, you know, really feel dark on the inside, so you show an enormous light on the outside, and you do anything to kind of deflect responsibility, you repudiate it, you abdicate from all those kind of things. You don't have to make commitments because you're just a dandy or whatever it is. You're a floozy or whatever. And, you know, I always, you know, you can run. I always preferred to run from responsibility, because if you lash out, you know, they're the only two options. You can either run or lash out. But if you lash out, it shows that you care. And so you kind of don't want to do that. And Sula's the same. You don't want to lash out because you don't want the world to know that they're causing you so much pain. You act like you're better than it. I think I talked in the memoirs episode about Quentin Crisp, and that his idea of everyone just looking at him with absolute disgust because he was such a dandy and so unashamed of his sexuality, and he's just like defiant. I do not care. I am going to be as outrageous as you think I am to show you that you're not getting to me. But of course they're getting to him. They get to everyone. And I think that's, why Sula ultimately kind of runs to other women's husbands in the town. And also, she doesn't love them. That the other women hate that, she's not just sleeping with their husbands because she loves them. She's just using them and throwing them away, like a man would do. And a lot of the women in town, and Nell particularly, like, you can't act like a man. And she's like, why not? I can act like a man if I want to act like a man.
Yeah. It's a great line.
Yeah. But, I think so that's that freedom and responsibility, and is kind of what is this pivot point on which Sula is always in fear and acting out of fear and defining all of her moves, which is just, a massive theme in literature. And I don't know, I think Morrison encapsulates it so well in such a small book. It's such a kind of like, how are you doing this? I don't like
so many characters, so many different storylines, all so incredibly dense, but still a very short book. She does incredibly well with this. I completely agree that I think she's very irresponsible, but I think I don't know if it's fear as much as she's genuinely confused, because to Sula, the relationship between her and Nell is the most important thing. And they grow up. I mean, I've got the line here. They grow up, and when they're kids, they always laugh at the women who are jealous, because they both knew that those women were not jealous of other women. They knew that they were afraid of losing their jobs, afraid their husbands would discover that no uniqueness lay between their legs, and they grow up together and they're best friends forever. And growing up, they compare kissing boys, and to them that's the relationship that binds them. But then all of a sudden, and growing up, Nell has a very conventional life, whereas Sula's in this household where her mum's sleeping with everybody. And so I think Sula has this very fluid idea of sex and what men are. And obviously her mum just tosses men apart and she burns her son alive. So Sula's like, oh, men can't be that important. But then her best friend Nell just suddenly leaves and goes off with a man. And Sula, I think in her mind, she actually genuinely thinks that she can do it and it won't cause Nell pain in the way that it would for a normal person. She's just like, oh, it's a men. Like, we've shared men in the past. Why not now? But obviously Nell is like, what the fuck? And it ruins their friendship. And then there's the great line of Nell crying about it. And she's like, I've lost my husband. I've lost Sula. I'm so angry right now, but eventually this anger will fade and I won't even have the hatred in me anymore. It'll all fade into nothing. And I've lost everything. And I loved that line. But yeah, I think Sula's just, avoiding a lot of responsibility and avoiding what it is to live in the world. But I think it's also just how she is, like how she was raised in this very fluid household. And yeah, she's a fantastic character. I love the way I'm not too sure what the point of Shadrach is. I don't know if you haven't a thought on that, but I took them as she's put in Shadrach to be a polar opposite in terms of views for Sula, because very early in the book, everyone's a bit wary of Shadrach. I mean, he's a young, strapping lad that looks good, but he's walking down the street, crazy, ringing cowbells, chanting Suicide Day on January 3rd. And everyone's really scared of him. But then they realize that he's just going to swear at you. He's not going to cause you any pain. He never looks at women the wrong way. He just sort of does his thing and moves along. And they accept him very quickly and they understand where they can fit him into their society. But then they get Sula, who sort of interacts with society a bit more and causes a bit more pain, and they completely shun her for being crazy in a sense, whereas Shadrach is accepted in society. She is not, because she's more within the society. So I think they go quite well together as opposites, and how you can accept a certain kind of crazy if it fits into your idea of what crazy is, whereas Sula's this much more in the society and causing issues, so they completely shun her. And they call her a witch and everything. And then I love the fantastic part about this book is they call her a witch, they think she's possessed, but then their way to treat that is putting broomsticks across their door and gathering up the dust where she's walked and stuff. So they think she's a witch, but they're the ones doing like these, you know, skeptical kind of things to try stop her coming in and stuff like that, which I love as well. I don't know if you picked up on that, but the town is also a bit sort of possessed by this mystic kind of belief that Sula's not really, because she's obviously got a few issues in her head, but she's not a witch at all. She's just amoral, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just love that how the interesting tessellation that Morrison always has with these characters and plays them off, and you think, oh, what's she trying to say? But if you just kind of let it happen in front of you, it makes it so interesting to like, what is the connection between Shadrach and Sula? Why is this character of Shadrach there? Or what is this painting of the town that she's done? Why is she looking at the town this way? And I think, in one way you get the idea about, because Sula's a woman, she gets held to a much more dire set of taboos and aspects like that, and she's a witch and a slut and all these kind of things, and yet all the husbands are fine, as long as they don't fuck white women, it's all good. And but I think there's a good, because Bottom has its own vibe, and of course Morrison's painting a real shares some beautiful lines. I think there's a great line which really struck me, which I think gets it. I think the kind of picture she paints of kind of black folk in this part of America and in this time, and what they are dealing with, what they've suffered under, and how that reflects in their culture and how they deal with things, and therefore what they can accept and what they won't accept. And they'll accept a crazy guy so long as he doesn't do whatever, which wouldn't be accepted down in Medallion. But the black folk are okay with him. He just yells around a bit, drinks some wine on the street and stuff, and
catches his fish,
sells people fish on a Friday or whatever. Everyone's kind of happy with that. He's just Shadrach. He's the guy. He's just the guy. Like, there's no real problem about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's a good line. What was taken by outsiders to be slackness, slovenliness, or even generosity was in fact a full recognition of the legitimacy of forces other than good ones. This is what, the perspective of black folk that Morrison's putting out here. They did not believe doctors could heal. For them, none ever had done so. They did not believe death was accidental. Life might be, but death was deliberate. They did not believe nature was ever askew, only inconvenient. Plague and drought were as natural as springtime. If milk could curdle, God knows robins could fall. The purpose of evil was to survive it, and they determined, without ever knowing they had made up their minds, to survive floods, white people, tuberculosis, famine, and ignorance. They knew anger well, but not despair, and they didn't stone sinners for the same reason they didn't commit suicide. It was beneath them. I love this line because I think it gets it so much, and the kind of resilience of a culture which has survived anything, and therefore it doesn't accept kind of cheap outs, if you know what I mean. It doesn't accept just rejecting someone because they've fallen slightly outside the lines. People are just trying to get by. They know that you got to get by any way you can. It's a white man's world kind of thing. And so, I think that's a certain part of Shadrach's presence, is that there is a certain amount of acceptance, but where is the line? Oh, okay, Sula's the line. Sula's the line where you cross. And yet she does cross, and perhaps that's why she crosses it, because she wants to lash out. She wants to kind of hit back and show them that they haven't destroyed her. That she's still strong, that she's still Sula, that they're not better than her, and that she's no worse than them in any way. So maybe that's a bit why Shadrach kind of bookends. And also, I think just because they're quite lonely characters for different reasons. They both experience a real sundering, like I was saying with the exile thing. Obviously, with PTSD, there has been a literal sundering in his brain. Something snapped because of the trauma he's been through. And then with Sula, not to say that something hasn't snapped, maybe in a different way, when your mother says that she doesn't love you, when you see that your grandmother is willing to murder her own son, when you are complicit in a child's death, be it accidental or not, and then you have to cover it up, the guilt, the shame, all these emotions, that also is a sundering, which drives her away for years, and then she has to come, but she comes back. So I think it's kind of these two lives of how they deal with having this sundering, and how Shadrach deals with it by just drinking and sitting in a shack for 60 years, and then kind of by the end of it, he kind of once a year he kind of runs around with this ding and bell, and it's like National Suicide Day for some reason, and people, it's like a thing. It's like, people refer to it like, I remember getting I got this haircut on Suicide Day. Like, it becomes a thing in the bottom that this crazy guy walks down the street and rings a bell, and sometimes some people parade behind him, but then that's it. It just happens on January 20th. Yeah.
January 3rd.
Is it January 3rd? Yeah.
January
so I
3rd,
guess it's an interesting way to demonstrate the kind of lines in this town, and the kind of what they're willing to accept and where they're at. There's also the big gentrification illusion, in the sense that they want to build a big tunnel through the mountain, which the bottom is situated on, which would mean, kicking out all the black folk from the place they were kicked out to, again.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the men in the town who can't get jobs because the white people won't give them jobs, they want the tunnel to happen because they would be able to do the road work, hopefully. So you get this kind of complication where they're going to do the work, which kicks themselves out. And so, very complicated, ideas about gentrification and about, this time in America, and the chapters are set in years. So you have a pretty, there's not much ambiguity about, the time in America that Morrison is writing about, or the implications of what's happening in America at this time.
I think it's interesting that like the second reading was so much better, but just that point you said that they're going to build the tunnel to kick themselves out. It opens with this special kind of evil, in that the white man's like, I wish I could have the land up in the bottom, and instead of just giving the land to the African Americans, he essentially makes them beg for it. He's like, oh, the land up there is so good. And so this former slave is like, oh, please give me that land. Please give me that land. And he practically makes them beg for a piece of land he knows is shit. And so he makes them beg for it. And then at the end, they're obviously building the tunnel, which then kicks them out. So it's this other sort of bookend I found with the town, because making them beg for it and then making them build something that'll kick them out of it is this interesting little bookend of the bottom.
The old bottom doesn't come out on top.
So what did you think of when Sula's dying and Nell comes to see her? Because that's quite an interesting scene.
Yeah, that's such an interesting scene. And Nell's
They haven't seen each
uh,
other in what is it, 10 years at that stage. I think they've gone without speaking. 10 years since Sula's slept with her husband Jude.
yeah, and Sula sends her straight off to the pharmacy to get like medicine or something. Just like picks the friendship up. I think Nell
Picks up
says
those
that, like
threads. Yeah.
picks up the further friendship as if nothing had happened or if she'd been there yesterday or something.
Yeah.
But then Nell, confronts her, hasn't talked to her since Sula kind of slept with her husband, and poor old Nell's life fell apart. And anyway, and they kind of get into this convo about Sula and her life, and you kind of get this where the two have separated and where their lives have diverged in terms of Nell following the path and of the prefabricated kind of life and just doing the right things, and yet still ending up in heartache, and then Sula kind of going the audacious individual existentialist route. And then Sula says, you think you don't know what life is like just because I ain't living it? You think I don't know what your life is like because I ain't living it? I know what every colored woman in this country is doing. What's that? Dying just like me. But the difference is they dying like a stump. Me? I'm going down like one of those redwoods. I sure did live in this world. Really? What have you got to show for it? Show to who? Girl, I've got my mind and what goes on in it, which is to say I got me. Lonely, ain't it? Yes, but my lonely is mine. Now your lonely is somebody else's, made by somebody else and handed to you. Ain't that something? A secondhand lonely, which is such a line. Yeah, and so quite brutal when Nell's just like, oh shit, yeah, I didn't even make my own decisions and I still ended up lonely.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah. But it's also like when I was talking about Sinbad.
This is just what I thought.
A couple of weeks ago, she's being judged on how she's dying. She's dying with no one by her side. She's not being judged on how she lived her life, or she kind of is, I guess. But like, it's all about how you're dying. It's just and she's like, I don't care how I'm dying. I lived my life how I wanted to live it. I was always going to die at some stage. Like, are you not aware of that? Yeah. Life comes and goes, and I've lived my life, and you haven't lived yours, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because it's so bizarre. I mean, I also thought of what you were talking about and about Sinbad, because you have to base someone's judgment, I guess on how their life ends. It's just one small episode in the course of a lifetime, depending on obviously case by case basis. But because. But then again, most people kind of live their whole lives based off the fear of how they will die, I guess, in a way. So I guess that's really how everyone thinks of it. Because the Nell character, who's kind of most people in a way, base the entirety of their life on how it will end and tick all the right boxes, do all the prescribed things to make sure that when they're old, they've got someone to take care of them or to take care of, and that they'll have some neat little pension and that they'll have, security. And then that can get taken away anyway. I think there's a great speech that Jim Carrey gives about his father took like a safe job as an accountant and still got fired. And then they had to like live in a caravan or something. Yeah. And he said, like, the lesson I learned was that you can take the safe route and still fail. So you may as well.
You can do everything right.
Go for the audacious route. Yeah. And that's what Sula does. Sula, the Sulas of the world don't accept the prefabricated life. She's born an artist. She wants to take chances, set sail. She wants to be surprised by what happens in her life. Doesn't want to know what happens already. That's, how her life's going to turn out. Of course, you hope it's going to turn out for the best, but you're vulnerable to it turning out for the worst. And you kind of know that that's what requires the courage and the audacity. And, but Sula's saying at least her destitution and her life ending in without the friendship that was her primary thing, as you said, she really didn't care about anything else but Nell.
Yeah.
I thought we shared everything.
Yeah.
So why was this guy any different? You're my son. I orbit around you. And then so, she doesn't want to die a victim, though, of course, and that's why she dies in her own, with her own mind, with her own memories, which no one else can say they lived her life or like she did. She gave it, to like use like a kind of sports post-match, I gave it 110%, whatever. I couldn't, math isn't their forte, but
yeah. But even right at the end, she as she's dying, her last thought is of Nell, and she wants to tell Nell that it was painless and it was kind of easy in the end. And that's like still in Sula's mind, Nell is just the only thing that really matters, is her best friend, her life partner kind of thing. And she's like, I wish I could tell Nell that this was painless, this was easy.
Yeah, the death was a little bit like Stoner.
Yeah.
In a little way.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, the other thing is that, of course, so she did, choose this individual life, but of course, in the end, it's not really, in her mind, she's not a victim, but of course, she is a victim. She's the result of Plum burning up and Chicken Little sinking down. And of her nature, and it's, kind of, was she always fated to live this way? Was she always fated for it to go badly? If someone had given Sula a violin, if her mother and her grandmother had been, in different moods, if World War I hadn't happened, if she hadn't been Black in that time, in that place in America, who would have known what this intense curiosity, or whatever Morrison describes it, this gift for metaphor, that is what an artist is. That's what Aristotle says. You gift for metaphor, you have different likenesses for seeing two different things, for relating things. That's in that collision between things is where art comes from. She could have been a great artist, she could have had a very different life, but
I think it was also like what would have happened, because the town uses her as just as a mean to their ends and justification of evil. They
scapegoat.
They scapegoat the hell out of her, and they say, oh, if we don't, like, before she comes along, they don't treat their husbands well, and then she comes along, so they start treating their husbands well because they're scared their husbands will leave them for her. And then as soon as she leaves, then they just go back to normal and stop treating their husbands right. And what's the little boy? The boy falls down the stairs, and everyone says he was pushed by Sula, and they use her as a scapegoat for that. And she just gets scapegoated by this town. And what would have happened if they just accepted her the way they accepted Shadrach? Would she have done all this stuff the same way? You don't know. You do not know.
And perhaps with the exception of Shadrach, what do you think of men in Sula? What do you think of the depiction of the men in this book?
I think they're used. I mean, in Sula's family, men are just used and tossed aside, and I think they're definitely used as the tool to show Sula and Nell's relationship. And I think that's the focal relationship of the book, because men are really portrayed as this non-important sort of object and treated as a non-important object by Sula. She really only falls in love the once with Ajax, and then he bails. But Nell hates her. Is it Nell that hates her dad, and that's the only thing that keeps her going in the early days, is the hatred for her father. So many used as a tool to I guess highlight the importance of Sula and Nell's relationship and what that actually meant to Sula. But then obviously Nell grows up and develops these strong affections for Jude and marries him, and that's confusing for Sula. She's like, what's going on? Our relationship was the relationship. Now you've left me for a man, and I'm going to sleep with him, and now you got nothing.
Yeah.
What do you think of men in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the men as objects and the men as tools, like you said. I think there's also that larger there's that scene where Jude comes in after Sula's return, and he's kind of complaining about, something some white person's done to him that day, as I think he's a checkout clerk or something at the time, or works in a hotel or something. And then Sula says like, oh, I'd love to be, a black man's better than being a black woman. And she kind of just has this different angle of looking at it. But I think, the men are described in this, I think, Plum to some extent, but certainly Jude and the other men, when they're talked about as a kind of group, or, as just men in general, meaning the black men in this case, that, they can't really, they're miserable because they can't get ahead. They can't service their pride. They can't even get a job, not out of their own, for lack of trying or anything like that. They're being kept in a place. And that, I think Sula says that, she has this, it's an interesting scene actually, where, Sula kind of shows that she doesn't really understand what love is. And she kind of has this very pessimistic idea, or I don't know, pessimistic's not the right word, but she talks about this idea, like if, all white men, want to do is castrate you. All they do is think about your dick. If that isn't love, then what is? And she kind of says like a bunch of different examples of things like that. She's kind of got this unusual perspective which she takes. But there's a particular line, I think, where maybe talking about something that Ajax said, and it's like, all they want, man, is their own misery. Ask him to die for you. Ask to die for you, and they'll be yours for life. And that's what I think Jude says, that he wasn't even really that smitten with Nell. He kind of just wanted someone, I can't remember the exact line, but wanted someone to care for him who wasn't his mother. And so there's always this man-child thing, which of course happens with Plum as well. And Eva refuses to be that carer again for her son, refuses to wean him off heroin, refuses to put her finger up his ass in a different way. And she's like, grow up, kind of thing. But of course they can't grow up, because all of them in different ways. It's in the kind of structure of the history, of course, and in the how Morrison builds up this town and the pressures upon men in this town, that they're miserable, and they want someone to care for them because they can't all they can do is lick their wounds, they can't do anything about it. That's oppression. So I think that breeds obviously quite toxic masculinity in a way, and obviously toxicness is coming from above. But so I think it's a very interesting and well thought out depiction of men in this book, and contrast well to this very powerful, and also, I mean, this is the early 70s. There aren't that many examples of books where the real focus is just a female friendship. Countless books of male friendship, most of them in which the dudes fuck each other. I mean, but it's not. It's Morrison is this is quite powerful stuff for the 70s.
No, it's a great book. It is a great book, and the second read was so much better. I think just knowing where you end up with Sula means you can pay so much attention to how she got there, and I loved it. It was so much better the second time.
Fabulous book, yeah. And really excited. There's so much more Morrison to read, and I'm kind of, I don't know, maybe pop my head into something as a holiday book, perhaps. But I'll have to, not sure which to choose next, perhaps Song of Solomon or Paradise. I'm not too sure. She wrote quite a few books. And yeah, I don't know. I think she's just a fabulous writer. And I mean, she
Very
kind
refreshing.
of received accolades in her own lifetime and was seen to be a master in her own lifetime. But she had such an interesting career, such an interesting life. You know, she was an editor at Random House for all those years. She was a professor at Princeton and Cornell and all these places. And like, as a writer, looking at Morrison, obviously you love the mastery, but it's also good to know that you can be an editor and a writer, that the two aren't mutually exclusive, that you can teach and write, the two aren't mutually exclusive. You can be a mother and a writer and not mutually exclusive. And I always, the things, you always hear these great stories, especially when people talk about, like Angela Davis, or other people talk about when Toni Morrison was, and she edited Muhammad Ali and lots of other, big names, and Angela Davis, and of course, enormous amounts of fiction. And she pushed a lot of people up, like Sula. She made a lot of other, especially Black writers who would find it very hard at that time in America to get widespread reviews, to get reviews in the Times, to get real, or for like a major publishing house like Random House to take them on. And Morrison really championed these people. She didn't think, oh well, if I'm publishing, that means that, she didn't treat everything like it was a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And all the while, she's getting up at like 4:30 a.m. and then she says that she's always writing in the margins of the day. Yeah. And it's not until even Sula, she's working full-time and as a mother. And I'm not sure if at the time of Sula she was already teaching, but at some point she starts teaching on Fridays as well. And so she's writing in cabs. There's all these stories about her, she just scribbles notes and stuff in cabs. So she probably wrote Sula 4:30 a.m. to like 6:30 a.m. and then in cabs, on trains, in all these different places. And yeah, I don't know. It's good to know that
it's incredible
that someone could have such a life and still manage to do it.
Yeah,
still manage to.
It's incredible. Yeah,
amazing.
Well,
especially because I've been struggling to get up recently. God, to keep my early mornings, I don't know, especially in the winter, I just kind of
the winter's tough.
Another half an hour, and then 6 becomes 6:30, and then 6:30 becomes 7, and then 7:30, and then you got to start work at 9. So I mean, at least there's no commute with homework and everything. So
yeah,
but oh God, yeah, it takes a toll, and I really, writing in the margins of life it's not easy. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time now, and not as long as Toni Morrison, but I guess it's good to have. She seemed to be able to delineate her editing and her writing so well, which is something which I think maybe other people have struggled with. So it's good to see. It's good that someone can do that. It's
refreshing. Yeah.
Well, anyway, that was Sula. That was Sula. Great.
Sula. Toni Morrison. Great. Check it out.
Toni Morrison, great book. And
great book.
Do some more dives on Toni Morrison at some point, I'm sure. Speaking of what we're getting ahead on this week, though, what are you reading?
Bartleby the Scrivener.
Oh, Dickens.
No, Melville.
No, sorry, Melville. Oh, sorry. I was thinking Barnaby Drudge, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
The unfinished Dickens novel. But okay, the Scrivener. I've
Bartleby
never read
the
this.
Scrivener. It's odd. It's very different. Obviously, having read Moby Dick. Yeah. It's about a dude living in New York. He's a scrivener at a law firm, and he's just this odd character, and he's always at work, and his line is, "I'd prefer not to." So he's always just saying, "I'd prefer not to."
That's my line.
Can you do this for us? And he's like, "I'd prefer not to."
Prefer not to, actually.
And no one sees him eat. No one. He's when like they come in and he's always there. When they're leaving, he's always there, and he's just sort of this little force that's in their offices, and they start to get a bit weirded out by him. And that's where I'm up to. And he just keeps saying, "I'd prefer not to." So it's a bit quirky. It's a novella. It's only a few hours, I think, but very different.
Are you listening to it?
Dick. Yeah, I'm listening to it. It's free.
Is it a good narration?
It's a free one. It's a nice voice. Yeah, he's got a very nice voice, and the way he says "I'd prefer not to" is "I'd prefer not to." Yeah, it sounds a lot better on the Audible, I promise. But yeah, what are you reading this week?
I've been dabbling in a couple of things.
Lovely.
Last episode or a recent episode on memoir had me thinking of memoirs that I wanted to read. And one I'd always wanted to read. As you know, I used to work at this kind of bar cafe on Manly Beach in Sydney called Hemingway's.
Yes.
And the owners at some point, long before I worked there, feel there's a big bookcase on one wall full of books, and most of them are crap. Most of them, just fillers, and some of them aren't even in English, and you just get I don't know where they got them from, but they didn't like people taking them. I think I might have been allowed
to buy them.
I might have been allowed to take one or few in my time that I was like, oh, come please, like, let me have this. But there was one in the corner which I promised myself actually that I was just going to take when I left, and then I forgot. But it was Palimpsest, which is Gore Vidal's first memoir. And I was a big Gore Vidal fan, and so I always wanted this. But then we did our memoirs episode. I was like, oh, I forgot that I was gonna. So I found a copy of Palimpsest. I've been reading that. So it's just kind of Gore Vidal at his polemic, beautiful best, gossiping about everyone. Absolutely showing everyone's dirty laundry in public, talking about all of his great kind of feuds with Truman Capote and Norman Mailer and Buckley Jr. and all these people. So real saucy stuff, as you would expect.
Nice.
And the other thing which I just started reading today is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And I've only read the first chapter in a bit, but it's very good. I was recommended this by a couple of people. And so I'm kind of meaning to get to it. And yeah, really good so far. It's got a very, very nice, witty, humorous tone to it. And I'm already kind of gripped. So
good. That's good.
It's about a guy who he's a count, he's an aristocrat, and in Russia, and the Bolsheviks come to power, and he lives he's got a place in Paris, and he lives in this suite at the Metal Hotel in downtown Moscow, and then he gets drawn into Kremlin to face up to some, I think he calls it, some goateed committee. Obviously, everyone trying to look like Lenin and Trotsky, but some goateed committee, and they say, I can't remember exactly, but instead of just putting him up against a wall, which is what they want to do, there's some party members or someone who stop them and decide that he's just going to live in, he can live in the hotel for the rest of his days, and he's never allowed out. And so he's kind of just a prisoner in the hotel, and he's like, yep, cool, I'll take that, cheers. Yep. And walks out. No one, when someone gets taken to the Kremlin and they're an aristocrat, they're going to get shot against a wall. There's no two ways about that. If you're a white Russian, you're going to get shot. And so he gets out, and he's out in Red Square, and the sun's shining, and some beautiful lines about some beautiful writing. And he kind of gets back to the hotel. This is all, the first chapter, so there's no spoilers. And, they're like, actually, no, you don't get to stay in your suite. You can stay in these like old, like butler's chambers, like in the back somewhere. Yeah. But we'll bring some of your stuff for you. And he had this big suite and whatever. And he's like, yeah, you got to bring my desk. And the desk is like really heavy. And he's got, all these amazing things from this very aristocratic life. And he's friends with all the hotel staff, and he seems like a really witty, charming, friendly guy that, you know, all the hotel staff like him and are like glad that he didn't get shot and all this kind of stuff. And he just gets this tiny little shack that, you know, there was a window in it with a pigeon at it. The first time, the description of the window, it's the size of a postcard. The second description, it's the size of a stamp.
Yeah.
You know, like it's getting smaller, the more furniture that gets in it that they fill in. And then finally, you know, like the guards leave and the hotel staff they have some drink a bunch of brandy that he was able to take from the suite, and then they leave and he sits on the ground and undoes a latch in the bottom of one of the legs of the desk, and it's full of gold, and so are all the other legs.
Oh,
and that's how the first chapter ends.
Yeah.
So I think the whole book is going to be set in the hotel, but it looks like, you know, there's already some interesting cool stuff going on.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
Yeah. All right.
Well, that was another episode of On the Same Page, deep dive of Sula. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you made it this far, keep listening.
Peace out.
Peace.